So we're going to go to this next story, and this next story relates to HDZero announcing that they were going open source. And one of the things that happened was that I think somebody on a live stream said Tony Cake said some stuff. I didn't see the comments. You told me that Ivan from Orca said some stuff. I didn't see those comments. And Ivan actually deleted some of the comments, or all of the comments. So out of respect for the fact that he said some stuff that he obviously decided to take back, we're not going to dredge up those comments and then sort of grill him about them. We're going to say, okay, you backed away. We'll let you do that. But Carl, there was some criticism and questioning about HDZero going open source, and is it really open source? And Carl talked about that stuff, and that's what we're going to talk about is Carl's statements, not necessarily the things he was replying to. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, you have you kind of have two sides of this coin here. Which, like I said, you have Orca doing their own thing and they know what's best, and then you have HDZero. So we've got an interview from MadsTech. This is basically a set of clips from his interview. He's going to be releasing a full interview later this week. This is a great interview so far. I'm sure the full one will be excellent as well. And he talks to Carl about some of the things people have had concerns with. Different, the pricing issues and margins and why the margins are like they are. Great information. But yeah, one of the things they talk about here is that essentially, when they're open sourcing, all they can open source is the software and the hardware designs to use the ASIC somewhere, because there's so much money invested in the ASIC. It doesn't make sense to open source an ASIC design because most people aren't going to build it anyway, and there's so much IP in it. And, he basically addresses directly what we've talked about before, which is he says Semtech also does the same thing.
Right. So I think you've leapfrogged slightly. So I'm going to back up a second. The general gist of the criticism was that if you open source the project, it's not really open source because it includes this chip, this ASIC, which is the heart of the HDZero tech, and that's not open sourced. And so if the whole thing isn't open sourced, then it's not really open source, was the gist of the criticism, which as you point out, and I pointed out separately on my live stream, and Carl points out again separately, if you look at Express LRS, the Semtech chip that they use is a closed source, whatever thing that Semtech sells, and anybody can make designs based on it, but that's where their money is. They can't give that away. And it's still open source in every meaningful way.
Yep. Yeah, it will be just as capable, hopefully, based on what they can do with the ASIC, I don't know. So I think that's a poor viewpoint to have, is to think that it's not open source because the ASIC isn't open source. That's an example of what we were talking about in the previous bit, if I could, which is that you have this, everyone is a little bit up their own butt in a way. Well, you know what I mean when I say you're up your own butt? I don't literally mean, I mean, like you're in your own head, you have your own perspective, and you're not thinking about things the way other people think about them because you have your own biases. And so you think you are the CEO of Orca and you see this thing and you go, well, that's a bunch of bullshit, and you criticize it. And you need someone who is outside of you to say, well, actually, wait a second, that's BS. That claim is BS. The problem is if you don't have that person, if you got a whole bunch of people who are up their own butt, then they all just go, yeah, you're right, that's a bunch of bullshit. And then you think you're, that's the problem. That's the risk, I think. Yeah.
What about the question about HDZero is not just selling the ASIC? If HDZero was only selling the ASIC and providing reference designs for other people to manufacture, that would be fine. And that, in fact, is what Express LRS does. The Express LRS project doesn't make any hardware. Well, I mean, they don't sell any hardware. You could make your own hardware, of course. Whereas HDZero is making video transmitters, making video receivers, and essentially competing with Foxeer, Runcam, Caddx, anybody who wants to make TBS, anybody who wants to make an HDZero. How does that different? What do you think?
Well, basically, let's put it like this. So basically, Carl says in his interview that, essentially he made the things because he had to make the things.
No, in 2019, Carl went to all the FPV manufacturers in China and said, "Hey, do you want to use these chips? We have a system that you can see called HDZero. That was what it was called in 2019.
Right.
And they shopped it around. It was a working system. Okay.
Right. Because the company's Divimath.
Yes, that's correct. Sorry, so he shopped the HDZero around to everybody. And then nobody wanted it. Everybody said, no, this doesn't make any sense. DJI just released a system. Nobody will do this. Fuck off with your ASIC. Nobody wants it, right? We don't care about your chipset. Fat Shark said, okay, cool. Let's try it out. And they made Bifrost, right? Bifrost was the first iteration. So, Bifrost was the first iteration, and that still didn't really bite. And then he didn't take off. Fat Shark didn't keep ordering. They didn't keep producing because nobody really bought into it and nobody really wanted it. Fat Shark didn't push the marketing, didn't push the hardware, didn't keep investing into it, right? So then Carl said, well, shit, I still want to do this.
Right. He didn't just give up.
But he also said, I have no clue what I'm doing.
Right.
I just have an ASIC and I don't know how to build for FPV. So then he said, okay, well, let's just start making hardware and then start asking people what they want.
Well, and it's an easy thing to see how it happened too. Carl wanted to sell the ASIC, and the HDZero system was in some sense supposed to just be a reference design, right? And he shopped it around and said, "Look, here's proof of concept. It can work. Do you want to build this? And I'll sell you the chips." And nobody took it. And rather than letting it die, he said, it's like a band who tries to get signed to a label, and no label will sign them. And finally they say, fine, we're going to record our own album. And they self-publish their own album, and they try to get on the radio, and they try to get in front, the radio. They try and get plays on Spotify and TikTok. What's wrong with me? But they try. I'm old. And eventually maybe they make it. And maybe then a label signs them, or maybe not. The analogy falls apart. But the whole point is that Carl doesn't want to be making this hardware. He wants the Fat Sharks, the Runcams, the Cadixes, the Foxeers, the TBS, the Immersion RCs of the world to be making this hardware. And they just weren't biting. So now he has to prove it himself. So
And what he points out is that's how we got the Race V2. That's how we got the V2, the camera, the new cameras. That's how we got the solutions that we have now and the improvements that we have to the system. That's why we have backpack integration. All this stuff came from users in the community asking Carl for what they want.
Frankly,
Carl helping to get that stuff made and produced and then try to get it out. I mean, that was the goal of Carl, is just to build proof of concept. Go like, hey, listen, this shit works. Please use these chips. Yeah. And that's the goal. So,
I mean, there's a precedent for this. If you look at the world of graphics cards, there's a big controversy in some circles over the fact that NVIDIA will sell Founders Edition cards, which are graphics cards made by NVIDIA, and NVIDIA will sell their chips, their silicon, to other integrators who will sell their own graphics cards, which will then compete against the NVIDIA Founders Edition cards, which are made by the hardware manufacturer itself. So it's not unprecedented to ask, is this a toxic relationship? What's the motivation here? But it's also not unprecedented for that situation to exist. And especially if I believe Carl when he says he doesn't want to be in the business of making hardware. And I believe him when he says it's not his specialty. I don't mean that as a slam. I think it's not the thing he's best at. And he doesn't like having to do it. I mean, he's willing to step up to the plate. He's doing an admirable job. But ultimately, if TBS said, hey, HDZero, we're just going to make video transmitters for you. Give us the chips and go sleep well at night. I think he'd be happy with an arrangement like that. So
that's what they want to do. So
okay,
all
right.
I don't know. It seems like he's got a lot of good thoughts about that stuff, and it makes sense. I just think the big contrast there is Orca and Emergent RC knows what you want. HDZero is happy to do whatever you think is best and help to develop a good product.
Yeah,
I think that's to me the big contrast between the two, and I'm interested to see how it plays out. And the HDZero goggle, if it works out properly, depending on who they're partnering with, which there are rumors about that, but depending on who they're partnering with, will be it'll be good. I don't know.
Yeah,
it'll be if they make a good goggle. That's a big benefit because they'll have a premium goggle, hopefully around a premium goggle price that also does analog that will have HDZero inside of it. So that could be a big selling point.
The other thing that brings up is the obvious competitive situation between Orca and HDZero. If the HDZero goggle is amazing, people are potentially going to buy it, and those are people who might have bought and will not buy an Orca goggle. Even people who use HDZero are buying Orca goggles to use it with. So whenever you've got two CEOs who are directly competing, it's hard to take anything they say about the other guy seriously, because it's just perceived as scared of competition. And, even when they're right, it's like on some level, you kind of maybe want to take the high road, which, he deleted his comments. So maybe he agrees.